Hi, everyone. So we're gonna get started, even though we'll have some folks trickling in. It is the lunch hour, so hopefully people are grabbing their lunch and coming in to join us. So we're really excited today. This is our second grid conversation that we're doing. Hopefully people were able to attend or at least view the recording of the conversation we had last week with folks from CMP, which I thought went really well. It was very informative. There were a lot of questions and a lot of great information presented. I'm going to share a couple of quick do-nows before I introduce our overview for the day. So, yeah, just welcome again. And for folks who don't know me, my name is Gabe McPhail, and I serve as one of the regional coordinators for the Community Resilience Partnership. I work collaboratively with some folks that are on the call today. I work with Abby Sherwin and Karina Grader of Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission, Sarah Mills-Knapp at GPCOG, or Greater Portland Council of Governments, and Laura Graziano and Emily Rabi of Lincoln County Regional Planning Commission. Together, we are the regional coordinators for Region 1 of the Community Resilience Partnership. We go by the Region 1 Coordinator Collaborative, or R1CC. We're also supported by several different nonprofit and state agency partners. And some of our partners are likely on the call today. So we are really excited, as I said, that this is the second of our grid conversations. It's actually the sixth of our Building Stronger Communities in Practice series, which builds off of the Building Stronger Communities online learning series that we offered with the other regional coordinators in the fall of 2022 and through May of last year. And we'll put a link to all of those recordings from the Building Stronger Communities and the In Practice series that have happened so far. We'll put that link to those recordings in the chat. They're a really good resource, lots of great topics, things that we hope you'll share with your communities. Great information. So the workshop topics that we've been offering in this series have been primarily focused on funding opportunities. They're based on mostly on things that you community members have shared with us, things that you really want to learn more about. And they're really designed for our Region 1 communities enrolled in the Community Resilience Partnership. And we're hoping that they're going to provide you with an opportunity to get a little more technical assistance, connect and learn from other communities in the region. But today, as I mentioned, this is a grid conversation. It's less of a workshop, more of a conversation, similar to last week's CMP grid conversation. So a lot of you in communities have shared with us, and we also, as assistance providers, have experienced this. There are a lot of challenges that communities can have when they're transitioning off fossil fuels, going to electric, especially when the work is related to setting and meeting emissions targets and meeting cost savings and efficiency goals. And we find that it's really not always easy to address concerns, especially coming from community members, whether it's about grid capacity or grid resilience. A lot of questions arise, not just, for us as planners, but for community leaders, for community members. So we have been compiling those questions that we're hearing from you. And we began answering some of those questions that we shared with our CMP representatives last week. And we today have some additional questions that we have asked Ethan Tremblay from the Governor's Energy Office to help us answer. So Ethan is the Policy and Markets Program Manager for the Governor's Energy Office. And rather than me giving you a full intro for Ethan, he'll share a little bit about himself and the work once we begin. But first, I just wanted to quickly go over the format for how we are going to structure today's conversation. So the conversation itself, we have like around 65 minutes for this conversation. It might be shorter, maybe it's a little longer. It really just depends on you all and like the questions that you have. Like we said, we want it to be more of a conversation. So usually, the in practice workshops, we start with a presentation, we follow with a Q&A. But for these grid conversations, Ethan will be like presenting and sharing a topic or some information based on some of the questions that we've asked him. But then we're going to pause and just, are there questions from you all? Are there things you want to learn more about? We're really hoping that you'll come off of mute and come on screen. And if you want to verbally ask those questions, that would be great. We recognize also it's lunchtime and sometimes it's easier just to put questions in the chat. So whatever works for you, but this is your time to, get some questions answered that you have. So that's the format that we'll use. And really to get the most out of this time, we'd really just want to adhere to that format. We will have time at the end for like any questions that just seem like, they're general, maybe they weren't, things that were covered in the topics or in the content that was shared or the questions that were asked. So we'll have a little bit of time for that at the end. And just really be conscious of the time that we have. So think about when you're asking a question, keep it on topic. If you don't hear your question being answered with the content that's being shared, we will have that time for those like off-topic questions at the end. So if you stay on topic, we didn't have this problem last time with anyone like hogging the airtime, but if we just keep in mind to share airtime with others, you don't, when it's time for questions, you really don't need to, raise your virtual hand. You certainly can. We invite you just to come off of mute. You can raise your physical hand if you want. We can call on you, whatever works best for you. This is, again, supposed to be more of a conversation. So our conversation, we have until 1:30 today, but a lot of people might need to hop off at 1. If that's you, please leave any unanswered questions you have in the chat. We'll get to those, and then you can come back to the recording and hopefully hear those questions answered. So I am going to go off my screen share, Ethan, so you can take over that aspect of the tech, and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gabe. I'm gonna share my screen and have you tell me that it's working before I try to start talking.
It looks great. Thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, thanks, Gabe, and the whole R1CC collaborative, and all of you for being here. It's a pleasure to have an opportunity to have this conversation. My name is Ethan Tremblay. I am the Policy Markets Program Manager for the Governor's Energy Office. I do want to just, before I jump in, please do ask questions. I think Gabe's going to help me monitor the chat. And if you want to just jump in at any point and ask something verbally, I'm happy to do that. I put together quite a few slides to try to explain who the GEO is and what we're up to, and focus in on some of the grid topics that I understand are of interest, but there's a lot of other things going on as well. And so happy to have a wide-ranging conversation if that's of interest to this group. So who is the Governor's Energy Office? To start with, we are the state's designated energy office. Every state has one. In Maine, it is the Governor's Energy Office. So organizationally, we are established within the executive department. We're not a separate department like the Department of Transportation or something like that. We work very closely with GOPEF, who you all are familiar with, I'm sure, and happy to have colleagues on the call today. Our responsibilities are carrying out the responsibilities of the state relating to energy resources. So that includes planning and development, policy, representing the governor in front of the legislature, and advocating on energy issues, and recently in a lot of work pursuing federal funding related to energy for the state. So our website is maine.gov/energy. We have an email list and regular communications. We have a lot of information there about just about everything that I'm going to talk about here. So we try to make that a good resource for constituents. I start off almost every presentation I do with this slide, and it's really just good context, probably familiar to many of you, but to summarize the state's climate and clean energy goals, which Governor Mills has worked largely with bipartisan majorities in the legislature to establish. So these include the state's greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements, which are 45% below 1990 levels by 2030 and 80% by 2050. Maine won't wait, the state's climate action plan that you're also likely quite familiar with is put forward by the Climate Council as the state's plan to achieve those greenhouse gas emission reductions. A key part of achieving those emission reductions and ensuring that we have a reliable, affordable supply of clean energy for the state are our renewable and clean energy targets. So those include what's called a renewable portfolio standard, which is the percentage of electricity delivered to customers in Maine that must come from renewable energy resources. And that is 80% by 2030. It's increasing each year starting a few years ago. Legislation was passed and it will reach 80% by 2030. Around this time last year, the governor also announced a new accelerated target of 100% clean energy by 2040 for the state. It was in part building on our success, making progress towards our renewable portfolio standard. Our office is working on a plan to achieve that 100% pathway to 2040, which I'll talk about in more detail in a couple minutes. Related is the state statutory requirement as well to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045. And then finally, recognizing that these targets not only help us achieve or confront the challenge of climate change, but also can help grow our economy and create good jobs for Maine people. The governor set a goal of 30,000 clean energy jobs by 2030, which is about a doubling from where we were at in 2020. So we are working hard to achieve these goals in partnership with communities in everything that we do. I have a few slides to just give you a sense of kind of what is the energy landscape in Maine today. There are a few things that make us stand out in exciting ways and also in challenging ways. So one of the challenges that we face is being the most heating oil reliant state in the country. 56% of Maine households rely on number two heating oil or heating oil for their primary heating source for their home. And when we add in all of the other fossil fuels, it's more than 2/3 of Maine households that rely primarily on fossil fuels to heat their houses, which is a challenge from an emissions perspective. It's also a challenge from an affordability perspective, because as we're all too familiar from recent years, fossil fuel prices are increasingly volatile and it can be a real challenge, particularly in the winter, for folks to fill the oil tank and afford all the other bills that they have. So this is a key focus for us as we work towards electrification, not only to meet our emissions reduction goals, but also to help control costs and reduce our exposure to imported fossil fuels. This slide has a summary. I won't spend too much time on it, but these are many of the objectives that have been established, many in statute associated with our overall energy policy requirements. So I talked a little bit about the renewable portfolio standard, which is that requirement for an increasing amount of renewable energy to be delivered to customers in Maine. To support achievement of that, there have been a range of procurements and other policies to support both the continued operation of existing renewable resources and also to bring new cost-effective solar and wind, biomass, hydro, and other resources online. You may be hearing more about offshore wind these days. The legislature last year enacted a target of 3,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2040. So it's another key piece of our renewable energy objectives, and our office is going to be developing the program to procure that offshore wind over the coming years. Energy storage is also a key piece of achieving our renewable energy goals. Storage is helpful when the sun goes down or the wind slows down. Energy storage helps keep the grid reliable and operating correctly. And so we have goals for increasing deployment of storage as well. And then finally, also solar deployment. We have multiple programs to support the deployment of solar and have seen a lot of success with that in recent years in the state, which we will talk quite a bit more about here, I'm sure. And then finally, I talked a little bit about our overdependence on heating oil. And so there are statutory targets for the reduction in that dependence, as well as overall the beneficial electrification strategies that are reflected in Maine Won't as we transition away from combustion of fossil fuels to move our cars and heat our homes and businesses and move towards electrification, which does not produce emissions at the same time that we clean up the electricity supply, reduce the amount of emissions needed to generate that electricity by switching away from fossil fuel and oil plants, natural gas and others towards more renewables. One thing our office has been doing for quite some time and that's really important to us is just simply collecting data and making it available to the public. And one area that we focus there is on tracking fuel prices. So we have a weekly survey during the heating season, and then it shifts a little bit less frequently, but is a year-round survey of heating fuel. So that's heating oil, kerosene, and propane across the state. So we track these prices closely. We make resources available to consumers. Right here is our winter heating season guide, which tries to compile all the different resources that are available from different state agencies and other entities to help folks who are concerned about their ability to heat their homes in the winter, and make a really centralized repository of information for that. So we're always trying to talk about that and make sure folks are aware. If you or others are looking for resources, they can go right to maine.gov/energy and find it right on our page for assistance there. We also use this data to track trends over time and make sure that we're informing our policy decisions based on what's happening in the world. So helpful in that sense. This is a slide from ISO New England, which is the regional electric grid operator. We'll talk more about in a couple of minutes. But what this shows you is across New England, we're an integrated energy market. And so across New England, the sources of electricity generation over the past 20 years or so. And one key trend that emerges when you look at this is the shift that's happened from back in 2000 on the left side of that chart. The regional fuel mix was heavily dependent on oil and actually coal at the time. And those plants, many of them are still around. They're just not running as much as they used to. But the transition has really been away from those oil and coal fossil fuel resources towards natural gas. Natural gas, due to the emergence of fracking and offshore drilling in Canada, has become a much bigger part of the electricity generation mix, as well as the fuels that folks use directly for heating homes and firing stoves and things like that. So it's lower emission, but still produces greenhouse gases. And ultimately, where this chart might go if we look out into the future is to see those green, particularly the green renewables category, which is only around 9 or 10% today, see that continue to increase as we rely more and more on renewable energy to generate our electricity. So quite a bit of progress has been made, but lots more to go to achieve these goals. Staying on data and kind of ground setting for a couple of minutes. So this chart that you're seeing shows the relationship between natural gas prices and wholesale electricity prices. And so the takeaway here is that our electricity prices in New England are heavily influenced by or determined by natural gas prices. And that's because, as we saw in the previous chart, so much of our electricity is generated by natural gas. So the recent price increases that all of us felt, and we have started to see a little bit of relief heading into this year, which is a good thing, but prices are still quite high. And that's really driven by high natural gas prices, which are the result. We don't produce any of that in New England. It's all imported. And so those global trends and conflict in other parts of the world, disruptions from the pandemic, other factors have really exposed Maine people to a lot of fuel price and electricity price volatility as a result of our fossil fuel reliance. At the same time, we like to see how we're doing in the region and also compared to the rest of the US. So this chart shows average retail electricity prices in Maine. Maine is the green line, so just second from the bottom. The dark blue line is the US average. So we are more expensive on average than the US as a whole, but at the same time, Maine is typically, and we go back and forth with Vermont on this time to time, but typically the least expensive electricity in New England. That's really due to a range of factors. It's hard to pin down any one, but important to recognize that trend over time. Energy efficiency is a key policy priority, has been for some time, and will continue to be. Folks are likely aware that efficiency is, generally speaking, the cheapest energy resource that we have. Is being able to use less rather than supply more. And so through a lot of different efforts, particularly at the Efficiency Maine Trust, as well as Maine Housing and other entities. Maine has made a lot of really great progress in recent years. We were ranked last year by the American Council for Energy Efficient Economy. They do a state scorecard, as you can see. Actually, I should stop saying last year. This is 2022. So that's more than last year now. But it was the last iteration of this scorecard that's come out. And so Maine was the most improved state at that time. I think we moved up from 13th or 15th all the way up to number 5. So in good company in the Northeast, other states, Massachusetts, New York, Vermont have also been prioritizing efficiency, but really excited to see that progress and continue our momentum to ensure that we are maximizing our efficiency resource at the same time that we work to transform our supply portfolio. Other initiatives of the Governor's Energy Office, one is what we call the Clean Energy Partnership. So this is a program that's established to advance our clean energy workforce and innovation, supporting the governor's goal of reaching 30,000 clean energy jobs, which I mentioned earlier. So we have deployed funding from a range of sources, principally the Maine Jobs and Recovery Plan, as well as other federal funding sources through the Clean Energy Partnership, focused on grants and other funding for workforce development, training programs, internships, career pathways, and other efforts across the state to make sure that Maine people are aware of, and when they're interested, they have the ability to access clean energy careers, and thereby we have the workforce to help us achieve our goals. We've also invested in innovation funding for startups, other financing mechanisms through this program, and it's all overseen by an advisory group, which you can see there at the bottom. They have public meetings. We welcome public input and stakeholder engagement to help set the direction for this program. But it really is a key part of our focus as we work to achieve the governor's objectives for our economy, as well as make sure that we have the people to do the work to achieve the goals that we're all working towards, and that those jobs are good paying, family sustaining jobs. So one of the things I mentioned right at the top about the Governor's Energy Office, actually, why don't I pause here and see if there are any questions? I just went through a bunch of kind of level setting information.
Thanks so much, Ethan. Lots of great information. Nils did put a question in the chat, and this was at the outset of your sharing. What was the thinking for using 1990 levels as a benchmark?
That's a really good question. So I'm assuming that's for the benchmark that the emissions reduction objectives are measured against. Ryan or Ashley might also know the answer to this question. I think it has to do with when there's good data available to be able to measure from, and then some level of trying to ensure consistency with how others who are setting similar objectives are measuring them from. So there are other states and entities that have used 1990 as the benchmark. And so I think it's a matter primarily of consistency. But Brian.
Yeah, the Kyoto Protocol was one of the first international conferences that set a date around when to start measuring, and that used the 1990 baseline. So I think most of the New England states use that as well.
Yeah, go ahead, Nils.
Thanks. Can I ask just another question? I was curious also about how you're defining clean energy jobs. And is the target of 30,000 new jobs or total jobs? And if it's total jobs, how many are you thinking of as new jobs?
Thanks, Nils. Yeah, really, really good question. So the 30,000 is total jobs. When that goal was set in 2020, we had about 15,000 existing clean energy jobs. And so 30,000 would be a doubling, more or less. So 15,000 new clean energy jobs, but we like to say 30,000 A because it's bigger, and B, that's kind of what people think of as like how many of those jobs are there in total. In terms of what counts as a clean energy job, there's a resource on our website that lays it all out in great detail, but it's everything from electric power system workers, solar installers, electricians, folks who work on the grid, energy efficiency careers, which I think is the largest share by sort of subsector. So folks installing heat pumps, weatherization, and other measures like that counted as clean energy, and then certain power production and other kind of clean tech sectors.
Great, thank you.
Sarah had a question. So can you talk a little bit about how we reach the RPS when we are not an integrated grid with ISO New England?
Sorry, when we are part of the
Oh,
integrated grid. So,
sorry.
yeah, just to talk about
Sorry.
like we have our own renewable portfolio standard as a state, but we were part of an integrated grid. So just how does that piece work?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and it at its core it becomes an accounting problem. So first of all, it's important to note that all of the other New England states also have renewable portfolio standards. They're all a little different, mostly in terms of timing. So Massachusetts, I think, has 2035 and 2050. And as an example, Rhode Island, I think, is 100% by 2035 or 2032. So they're directionally aligned in that all of the states are at different levels, but mostly pretty ambitiously committed to transitioning to renewable energy. But it is an accounting problem to ensure that each state is complying with its goal, because the RPS is the percentage of electricity delivered to customers in Maine that is renewable. And so that electricity doesn't have to be produced in Maine. It could be produced anywhere in the region, but we have to be able to demonstrate that our customers are the ones who purchased it for delivery, essentially. So there is a system of accounting that utilizes renewable energy certificates, which is basically the attribute that just certifies that a quantity of electricity is renewable. So if I own a solar farm and I generate renewable energy and I put it on the grid, then I also get a REC when I do that. I can sell that REC to someone who wants to basically use the renewable energy, and they do what's called retire it. And then we use that system. There's a database at the regional level that tracks those attributes and makes sure that there's no double counting that goes on, makes sure that there's, it's only generated by generators that qualify as renewable and so forth. But it is a kind of a tricky accounting problem to make sure that each state is meeting its goals. So another thing I was going to say, it's also important to note that most of Maine is part of the ISO New England grid, so this integrated wholesale market. There is a portion of the state in northern Penobscot County and Aroostook County that is actually not directly interconnected to the rest of New England. It's called the Northern Maine Independent System area. And it's only electrically interconnected to Quebec, or not to Quebec, to New Brunswick. So a little bit of a different situation up there, in that it's not connected to ISO New England, but important that we're aware of that when we're conducting energy planning and working on these goals.
Great, thank you.
Did that answer your question, Sarah?
Yeah, it did. I just one little bit of a follow-up. What is, and this might be overly technical, so I don't know if you have I'm just curious about sort of what is the relationship and sort of who holds a relationship at the states level with ISO New England, sort of how do you all interact together as states with ISO?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So ISO New England, and I'll just take a step back and start to explain ISO New England for folks who may not be familiar. So ISO stands for Independent System Operator. So the ISO is a federally chartered nonprofit corporation that has three kind of key functions for the New England states. One is they are the bulk system operator. So it's ISO New England that is responsible on a minute-by-minute basis for dispatching power plants all across the region to make sure that there's enough electricity to meet demand. So they forecast every day what the electricity needs for the next day will be based on weather and economic information, all sorts of factors, whether it's Super Bowl Sunday or not. They forecast the amount of electricity that's going to be needed across the region, and then they run a series of auctions for all of the competitive power plants to determine who will be dispatched. And that's a price-based auction. And so if they don't need much electricity, it's mostly the inexpensive generators. And on days when there's a lot of electricity needed, they might have to dispatch some of the more expensive generators that don't run very often. So that's one function that they hold. They also do the short and long-term planning for the bulk power system, so the transmission grid. And then they administer the markets. So not only that day-ahead electricity market and a real-time electricity market, but also it's called a capacity market, which is where once a year they contract with power plants to be available. just to make sure that there's enough to run if they're needed. And then other, what are typically referred to as ancillary services, grid services, like regulating the frequency of the electricity supply on the bulk system. So why ISO New England exists, they were created in around the turn of the millennium when Maine and most of the other New England states, all except Vermont, did what we call restructured our electricity market. So prior to 1999 or prior to March of 2000 in Maine's case, the electric utilities, Central Maine Power and Versant Power at the time, it was Bangor Hydro, owned the generation plants and the grid, the transmission and distribution system. And under restructuring, Maine and a couple dozen other states around the same time required utilities to sell off their generation assets in order to make a competitive generation market. So ISO New England was set up as kind of the entity. In a sense, they're kind of like an eBay. They're the platform on which competitive generators bid to supply energy. So ISO doesn't own anything other than their computers, but they administer the market so that generators can compete against one another to supply electricity in New England. In terms of how the state interacts with ISO, so they have they are federally regulated. They're under the jurisdiction of the FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is kind of the national PUC. There are half a dozen or so other ISOs or RTOs is the other word that they're referred to, regional transmission operators in the US. So there's ISO New England, which serves New England. There is New York ISO, which just serves New York. There is PJM, which is, I'm not going to remember what the acronym stands for, but they serve kind of Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, Ohio, Indiana, portions of Virginia, a lot of the kind of mid-Atlantic and into the Midwest. And then there are others, mid-continent, that serves a lot of the Midwest. California has its own ISO. So FERC oversees all of these entities across the US to ensure that they comply with federal law. This ISO has an independent board of directors, which it makes nominations to and are elected, and it has a stakeholder process. You'll hear the term NEPOOL, which is the New England, another acronym that I can't remember, power operators. NEPOOL is ISO stakeholder group. So it's all the generators, it is all the transmission owners, so CMP and Versant and other utilities, consumer advocates and others. And they work with NEPOOL and get stakeholder input on all of the kind of rules that they set, which they call their tariff, which is then overseen and approved by FERC. The states, New England states, long-winded answer, and this is ultimately where it lands, have what's called the New England States Committee on Electricity, or NESCO. And that is the voice of the New England governors, the states at ISO and in the region. So it has a board of directors that are appointed by each governor. So for Maine, Chair Bartlett, who's the chair of the Public Utilities Commission, is Maine's NESCO director. And so they meet regularly and work on primarily policy issues of interest to the states that are coming before ISO New England. So that's kind of the formal body that the states engage with ISO through. We also are in touch with them on a pretty regular basis when we have questions about what's going on with the grid or this plan or that plan. Our office participates in some of their processes, and they are generally in touch with the states.
Great, thank you. I don't see any other questions at the moment, so we're probably good to proceed. Great questions.
So this slide, I just want to talk a little bit about the state's energy plan. So if we go all the way back to the first slide I showed with this lighthouse on it, one of the functions of the governor's energy office is to lead the creation of the state's energy plan. So this is a process that we have underway right now. We are conducting additional analysis this cycle to work on what we call the pathway to 2040, which is how we're going to achieve the governor's goal of 100% clean energy by 2040. So we're undertaking some really sophisticated energy system modeling. I'll show you some draft results in a minute to give you a sense of what that's looking like and what the model and what the tools are. And we're also talking to a lot of stakeholders about it. So we've had a series of webinars beginning in August of last year to present draft results and take feedback and work on adjusting scenarios to help answer questions of interest to folks across the state. We will be releasing this in the next couple of months. We'll likely have a draft, take some public comment, and have an additional webinar. So if you're interested in the state energy plan development, I would encourage you to go to maine.gov/energy. Right on the front page, there's a sign up link for emails, and we'd be happy to have folks engaged in that process if you're not already. Oops. This is a little bit more about kind of the modeling that's being developed that I just mentioned. So when we are building an energy plan, I'll just kind of go through some of the basics here. It starts by forecasting what our needs are, how much energy will Maine consumers require when they turn the lights on and turn their heat pumps on and plug in their electric vehicles and fill up their gas vehicles and everything else. So we forecast electric and other energy demand across different sectors of the economy. We see on the left side of this significant growth, about a doubling of our electricity needs by 2050, primarily as a result of electrification as well as overall economic growth. That's driven by electrification in the heating and transportation sectors primarily. We also see, so that's a doubling in the amount of electricity, the kilowatt hours used. We also see 2 to 3 times increase in the peak electricity demand. So that's the amount of the kilowatts that are being used at the moment of highest use. In Maine, well, in many parts of the country historically and now, that's typically what's called summer peaking. So you can imagine a really hot summer afternoon when the outside temperature is very high, everyone has their air conditioner turned up as high as they can, and is at work and doing everything else that they would be doing. So that's when typically what a summer peak might look like. A winter peak, you can imagine a really cold winter morning just before sunrise when everyone's starting to wake up and realizing got chilly overnight and cranking up the heat and turning on the stove and microwave to coffee maker and otherwise getting going with their day. That's typically what a winter peak would look like. So over time, we expect Maine to become increasingly winter peaking, primarily because heating is such a significant portion of the energy that we use. And so the more that we're electrifying our heat, the more we'll start to see a transition to a winter peak. The size of a peak and the timing of a peak is heavily determined by the technology and the decisions that consumers are making. And so the more flexibility that we have in our electricity use, the more we can control that peak, and the lower the peak, hopefully the less investment in the grid that we need in order to meet it. Because at its core, the electricity grid is a very large machine that needs to be capable of serving the needs of consumers every hour of every year. And so it's sized to meet its single largest need that it might ever see. And so if we're able to lower that need, we can defer investment in the grid. So it's a key part of what we're thinking about in our energy plan. This drills down a little bit more into that concept. So we're talking a lot about load flexibility. How can we use the fact that particularly modern technologies like electric vehicles are inherently flexible when they consume electricity? So folks, some of you may be EV owners already or are considering it. One of the neat things about an electric vehicle is that you can plug it in. Many people charge at home. And you could plug it in when you get home at night and come back out to your garage or driveway the next morning and it's fully charged. Well, it usually doesn't actually need to fully charge from the moment you plug it in all the way until the next morning. It could charge in a few hours, and when it chooses those few hours can have significant impacts on the grid. So if everyone gets home at 5:30 and everyone plugs in their EV and starts charging at the same time, we might see a significant peak. But if some of those EVs wait until 6 or 6:30 or 7 to start charging, then we can spread that over time. Everyone still has a fully charged battery the next morning, and we defer investment in the grid. Now, there's a lot of details to sort of figure out how to do that. I'm kind of oversimplifying a lot of things here. But that's a general example of what we're thinking about when we're talking about load flexibility and recognizing that that has a significant amount of value for consumers going forward. I'll pause here and see if there are questions.
Thanks, Ethan. Yeah, we had a question. Is any official entity or nonprofit focusing on educating the populace about moving demand from peak hours to the middle of the day? I'm thinking of retirees, for instance.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So if we take a big step back, there are several ways, there are a lot of different strategies that you could use to achieve the kind of end result of having load flexibility. So I would say that a lot of, like, our office is thinking a lot about this. Other entities like the Efficiency Maine Trust and the Public Utilities Commission and the utilities are thinking about this. How you do it, there are a lot of different models we can look to from other states that have achieved load flexibility. One way is what's referred to as time of use pricing or time of use rates. And so what that means is that if, as an electric customer, if you choose to be on a time of use rate, you might pay, say 5 cents a kilowatt hour for most of the day. But if you're using during the peak, which would in Maine, say from 4 to 7 p.m., you might pay 15 cents a kilowatt hour. So the presence of that price signal gives a consumer the opportunity to save money if they are flexible, right? So I have an EV, I'm on a time of use rate, and we've programmed our EV to not start charging until 10 p.m. because that's when it's cheaper. So that achieves a couple of goals. One, it helps consumers save money, and two, it helps everyone save money because by giving me the opportunity to respond to a price signal and not charge when it's expensive, I'm not triggering the need for additional upgrades to the grid. Other ways that you can share that value with consumers, folks in other states, yeah, there's a lot of different programs, like peak time rebates are another thing that you see in some states. Technology that helps consumers take advantage of time of use rates. So like EVs are a good example. You can program, many of them you can program when you want them to start charging or stop charging. So you can make sure that they only charge during the windows when you want. Virtual power plants are it's kind of a broad term for a lot of different possible technologies like battery storage and distributed solar electric vehicles that we can use that can act as grid resources. So consumer education is certainly a part of it, but there are a lot of other things we can do, particularly with technology that help people. What we don't really want with load flexibility is for people to feel like it's a lot of work or a big barrier, because then it's hard to see the participation. So people in general have gotten really used to, over the past 100 years, the ability to flip a switch and have the lights come on, and to otherwise access the electricity that they want reliably. And we want to make sure that that continues to be the case, but that we use technology and new opportunities going forward to help deploy this kind of flexibility in a way that works for consumers and ideally saves them money.
Yeah, Nils, go ahead.
Yeah, Ethan, thanks. This is a complicated topic, and I'm trying to just understand a little bit better what load flexibility means. So is there embedded in the curves that you've put up an assumption about, say, distributed solar generation increases? Like, I'm trying to think about what underlies the management of peak loads and the flexibility that you're talking about. And then related to that, I mean, the conversation we had with CNP, I guess last week, they were talking about the real bottlenecks that they have in just delivering on the engineering work for solar projects, solar farms or household solar, and the numbers of projects. So can you just talk a little bit about like what's driving the load flexibility in your model?
Yeah, thanks, Nils. Happy to. So there's a couple. Yes, there's a lot of data and model behind this one chart that I'm showing. So at its core, what the load flexibility parameter is the percentage of load in every hour that we've we allow the model to move to a different hour. And then related to that, the number of hours that it can move load. So a no load flexibility case would be all of the demand in every hour stays in that hour. Maybe a low load flexibility would be, 1% of the load in each hour can move back 1 hour or forward 1 hour. So if this is what we originally forecast the load to be at 7 p.m. today, maybe 1% of it can move to 6 p.m. or to 8 p.m. That's it. And then if we increase those parameters, more load can move, and it can move kind of further in time. If that makes sense. What that allows us to do is to estimate and to demonstrate that there's value to that load flexibility. So for instance, what this chart is showing us is when there's no flexible load, we would forecast the distribution system capacity, the megawatts that the distribution system in Maine needs to be able to handle, to grow to like 7,000 megawatts by 2050. With some amount of load flexibility in what we call our core case, that distribution system capacity only grows to less than 6,000. So that's considerable savings. That would translate into considerable financial savings. What that modeling approach also doesn't do is tell us how we achieve the load flexibility. So it could be, that's the kind of thing we would look at those results and say, oh, we'd really like to be able to move at least 10% of the load at least 4 hours, for instance. But how we do that, do we call people and ask them to do it? Do we run a public information campaign? Do we have a time of use rate that is structured to get that response? The sort of programmatic how is going to be a continuing conversation for years to come, honestly. Does that answer?
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. So it's not an assumption about supply, it's really an assumption about the ability to shift demand to manage the peak loads. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Right.
Great question. Okay, I don't see any other questions at the moment, so.
Cool. I just wanted to I like this slide because I'm kind of you might have gotten this impression already, but I kind of like to geek out about this stuff a little bit. We don't have to spend a ton of time on it if it's not of interest to folks. But what I'm showing you here is what we would call a typical winter day in 2040. And this is in our core scenario. So this is basically what the state's policy commitments already are made, and then kind of what happens after that on a sort of least cost basis without changing any other assumptions. So on the chart in the middle of the slide, the left-hand chart, is the hourly electricity generation, so the supply that we would see in Maine on a typical winter day in 2040. So hour 0, the x-axis on the bottom is the hour of the day. So it starts at 0, which is midnight, and then goes up to 2 a.m., 4 a.m., 6 a.m., all the way to 23:59, which is 11:59 p.m. And then the y-axis is megawatt hours, the quantity of generation. So the intuition when you're looking at this middle chart is that on the bottom, we have some hydro and biomass resources, which tend to run pretty consistently hour over hour. So they're down there supplying electricity. We have a big section of light blue, which is offshore wind. Remember that this is just a single day. This isn't the average of all the days or something like that. So on this particular day, at midnight, the wind offshore is blowing quite a bit. We're getting almost half of our electricity from offshore wind. On top of that, that other light gray is onshore wind. That's also a considerable amount of electricity. And then the orange bar that you see are transmission imports. So those would come from outside New England, from either New York, Quebec, or New Brunswick, which are the 3 other regions that we have transmission ties to. So on this particular day at midnight, when the day starts, there's quite a bit of wind blowing. That's typical for the winter, and some amount of imports. Over the course of the day, the big thing that you see is that the sun rises and the solar starts to produce. That's that yellow that starts to show up around 6 a.m. and grows considerably to the midday hours, and then tapers back off in the evening. And then the other thing to highlight here are the discharge of battery storage, which you see in purple near the top, which particularly happens around those shoulder hours when people in the morning are waking up and starting to use electricity, and in the evening, particularly as solar starts to decrease. And then some thermal dispatchable generation. So that could be decarbonized gas, biofuel of some sort. That's also particularly needed around the beginning and end of the day, and then in the end of this typical winter day. So it's just kind of any old winter day. It's not remarkable. We do see the wind slow down in the evening on that particular day, and so there's some more thermal generation that kicks in. The load that this is meeting, the demand from consumers, is what's shown on the right. So it's mostly typical end use load. So that would be home heating, EV charging, other toasters and televisions and computers and so forth. And then there's the charging of energy storage, which happens in purple, and what we call flexible load, which we talked about a minute ago. So the amount of light blue load that you can see is sometimes negative, which means we've moved it out of that hour, sometimes positive, which means we've moved it into that hour. I'll see if anyone, so these are all draft results. They're not finalized. Happy to spend time talking about this or answer questions that it makes you think of, if that's helpful. And if not, we can move on.
Anybody have any thoughts or questions or things you want to ask? Looks like we can move on. This is great. This was very interesting. Yep.
So where do we go from here? I wanted to just give you a kind of a flavor of what the state energy planning is that the GEO is responsible for and is working on. We then will pass a lot of this off, and in general, there is responsibility on the part of electric utilities to safely and reliably operate the state's electricity grid. There's a lot that goes into that, as you know. There's billing, and there's customer connections, and there's disconnections, and there's communications, and there are storms that come through and outages that result in power restoration that has to happen. So the role of the electric utilities in helping to meet our climate goals, but also in ensuring that people have safe, reliable, clean service that they need, is a priority for our office, and a topic of a lot of conversation in the state recently and going forward. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what we often call LD 1959, which is an act regarding utility accountability and grid planning for Maine's clean energy future. This is a bill that Governor Mills submitted in May of 2022, or submitted it sooner than May, but worked with the legislature in 2022 to enact. So this bipartisan bill did a lot of things. It's aimed at improving the accountability and performance of our electric utilities, as the title would suggest. So it establishes minimum service standards, requires quarterly reporting in public report cards by the utilities of their performance in a variety of areas. So everything from customer care, the amount of time people spend on hold, and the amount of time people have to call back, and so forth. Bill accuracy, getting a correct electric bill the first time is critically important, as well as reliability, how often there are outages and how long those outages are. So on a lot of different metrics, it requires public reporting and performance monitoring from the PUC, financial penalties for inadequate performance, and then other expanded enforcement and financial monitoring and reporting requirements for the utilities. So really aimed at improving accountability and performance over time. This bill also created what we call an integrated grid planning process. So this requires the PUC to direct utilities to prepare, and then utilities to prepare what are called integrated grid plans. So these are needed to facilitate our transition to the grid of the future, a clean, affordable, reliable grid. It's really a recognition that the role of the utility has changed over time, and that what they need to do to prepare for new technologies that our consumers want today and that are being installed, and to prepare for the effects of climate change. All of that requires a deeper and more granular planning approach by the utilities. And this bill requires that to happen with public input in a stakeholder process facilitated by the Public Utilities Commission. So I've linked a docket here. If you've engaged with the PUC before and know how to access dockets, super. If you don't, you can just click that link, and it's basically an online document management system with a lot of different filings from all sorts of parties. And there are stakeholder meetings, which are basically webinars hosted through this process. It's currently focused on identifying stakeholder priorities from across the state that should go into the utilities grid plans. So our office participates in this process. We advocate for utilities to be supporting and enabling achievement of the state's climate goals and increasing their transparency with consumers and ensuring affordability and lots of other priorities. But we also encourage others from the state to get involved and to share their priorities and to participate in the process. It is complex. The grid is often referred to as the single largest machine on planet Earth, right? And so there's a lot of engineering complexity and regulatory complexity, but at the same time, folks need to be engaged, and the decision makers at the utilities and at the commission and elsewhere benefit from hearing the perspectives and the questions and the concerns of folks on the ground. So we really do encourage people to participate in those proceedings. The other another big piece of LD 1959 was the requirement for what are called climate change protection plans from the utilities. So this is should be closely related to and inform the integrated grid planning, but where integrated grid planning is looking at sort of customer needs and load growth and grid investments over time, the climate change plans are really focused on resiliency. And so these actually were all just first drafts were submitted by all the utilities by the end of 2023. So they just came in a couple weeks ago. And they're going to be reviewed and updated periodically over time. So that's another area where I would make a plug, particularly for this group, to take a look if you have some time. That docket link there, 2023-00282. Share feedback through the Public Utilities Commission's process and with the utilities. This is really focused on ensuring that their infrastructure is resilient to climate effects. So I don't think I need to tell anyone on this call or in Maine that we've felt several really severe storms just in the past couple of months in the state. My power was out for a week right before Christmas. And so as we continue to see and expect extreme weather events and other changes as a result of climate change, we need to ensure that this infrastructure is resilient to those changes that we know are coming. So a couple of good places to go for more information and consider participating if that's of interest to you.
Then we had oh, sorry. Did you want to do the slide before we do more questions, or are you able to do questions?
Yeah, let's take some questions here because I was going to
Okay.
change a little bit.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, so a question about storage and sort of like how much energy storage is happening in Maine.
Yeah, great question. There's a fair amount of activity in this space. Energy storage is, excuse me, energy storage is interesting technology because in a sense it's all around us, right? Many people have a cell phone or a laptop which has a battery in it, which is energy storage, right? You charge it and then discharge it later when you're using your device. So that's a really small scale. There is energy storage that is deployed like at buildings or in people's homes. You might be familiar with the Tesla Powerwall or Generac Power Cell or other products that are out there for consumers to be installed in residences or businesses for backup power and also potentially to provide grid services. And then there's grid scale energy storage, which could be, folks might have seen in the Press Herald, there was an article a week or two ago about a project in Gorham, which is 175 megawatts. So if built, that project would be, I think, the largest in New England. And there are other projects I was just reading, I think in Indiana, there's a 600 megawatt battery that's been proposed and recently approved. So there's a lot of storage happening in Maine, but also across the country. That's in large part because costs have come down considerably as we kind of figure that technology out. Energy storage is really useful for a variety of things. It can help us make renewable energy available in hours when it wouldn't be produced, which we talked a little bit about a couple minutes ago. Relatedly, but a little bit differently, it can help with reliability and resiliency. So having batteries like in your home, for instance, if you lose power and you have a battery, that could potentially supply you for a few hours or many hours, depending on how much electricity you're using. And if you have solar on your roof, that might charge the battery for you the next day. So it has a role to play in building our resiliency. It can also help with different grid services, helping regulate frequency or ensure capacity adequacy and other things like that. So a lot of different roles for storage. consumers that for consumers, the Efficiency Maine Trust has some programs and is rolling out more and over time with incentives for battery storage. So I would encourage you to stay tuned to what they're up to. Our office also, thanks to legislation passed last year, is preparing a utility scale, so a larger scale storage program, which we'll be filing with the Public Utilities Commission in a couple of months for approval. So that's also a key piece of achieving our state's goals for storage deployment, which I talked about earlier. Yeah, that's kind of the state of play on storage.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, that's pretty comprehensive. Question too, I just want to acknowledge we probably lose a few folks here since it's 1 o'clock or slightly past 1 o'clock. So hopefully people have left questions, but just want to get to a question that Kate put in the chat. There are certain areas that are more impacted by grid challenges than others. Grid challenges such as outdated infrastructure, strained grid, etc. Can you speak to how GEO is prioritizing these particularly vulnerable communities?
Yeah, definitely. A piece of that, it's a really great question, and there's a lot of kind of moving pieces of it. I would point to that integrated grid planning process as a key place where these conversations are happening. Decisions are going to be made. So yeah, I would say check that out, and happy to have a more conversation about kind of how that's working and what to expect going forward. I'll say we're still in a relatively early part of the process, and it's the first time it's happened. And so there's a lot of input being taken right now about sort of what should go into these plans and what criteria, including how to prioritize vulnerable communities, what sort of criteria should be considered, and decisions and information gathering of that nature. Another area I would point out, I didn't talk a whole lot about this, but our office is actively involved in pursuing and deploying federal funds from a range of sources, particularly the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. And so in many of those programs, there are priorities given to disadvantaged communities or vulnerable communities, environmental justice communities. And so that's a key piece of every application that we submit and every program that we roll out, whether it's new rebates for heat pumps and others that are coming, or our application for low-income solar program, or investments. We are going to announce soon a grid resiliency program to make grants to utilities and power system entities and others to improve the resilience of the grid with a focus on disadvantaged communities. So it's certainly a priority that manifests in multiple different avenues within our work.
That's great. Yeah, and I'll say too, which folks probably know, but there are many communities in Maine that are eligible to apply for a grant that's currently open but closing very soon, the EEPG grant through the GoPIF office and the Community Resilience Partnership, which is grants for up to 100,000 for qualified disadvantaged communities in Maine that are enrolled in the Community Resilience Partnership. Okay, I think that was all the questions from this last slide.
Well, I think I have just one more. I understand there were some specific questions about interconnection and solar installation or new load, like new heat pumps and other things like that, and how communities or municipalities or others, how those processes work. And so I wanted to make a little bit of a plug for places to go for information on that, but also just be a resource and answer questions or have a conversation now if that's of interest. And I know you had a conversation with CMP. I got to look at the slides. I didn't see the whole recording, but I'm glad that they came and spoke to this group and that line of communication is open. And I certainly hope that it continues to be that way. We are very much in favor of folks working directly with their utilities and also with the Public Utilities Commission and the Office of the Public Advocate, all of which I've linked here. They exist, particularly the utilities, right, exist to provide these services and to work for their customers. And so we encourage people to ask their questions and get their questions answered and consider them as a resource. So in general, interconnection is a topic that we think a lot about and do a lot of work on. There's kind of two sort of directions from which you might approach interconnection. One is as a load, like a new customer that wants electric service, wants to consume electricity, or wants to expand their service, consume more electricity than they were before. The other direction is as a generator. So for instance, for most folks, that would be want to install solar and put electricity onto the grid. The interconnection processes for those two uses are different. And that includes the sort of cost allocation, how much you pay and at what stage of the process is different, as well as generally speaking, like they are different departments within a utility because they're different sort of aspects of their business. But in both cases, if you are thinking about building a new house or a new building and wanted to establish electric service, or I'm in this case right now at my home, want to put on an addition and install a new EV charger and upgrade from, like, I have 100 amp service right now and I want to go to either 200 amp or 400 amp. All of that should involve contact with the utility. It might, particularly in the case of load, like if you're a house and you want to upgrade from 100 amp to 200 amp service, there might not be anything that they need to do. But it's good to talk to them and ensure that is the case. Or it might be that they need to replace a meter or upgrade a transformer or something like that. In many cases, those are needs that the grid has, and so that those would be paid for by the utility, shared among all ratepayers. In some instances, there's a cost share for customers. So if you're asking for new service at the end of a long driveway or significant upgrade or something like that, there are terms and conditions that govern those. They typically are a flat fee of some nature, but it's important to contact the utility and open up that conversation. The Office of the Public Advocate exists to advocate for utility customers. So they're a really good resource for folks, whether they're concerned about their electric bill or their ability to pay it, or a potential disconnection, as well as new service or any other aspect of what we're discussing here. They're a really good resource and have folks standing by to take calls and work with consumers on that. And then also the Public Utilities Commission. As the regulator, they regulate and oversee the utilities, and so they're responsible for holding them accountable, make sure that they're following the rules, clarifying any vagueness or ruling on disputes between utilities and customers. So they're also have all their rules available online. There's different chapters of rule. It's 324 for solar interconnection and 395 for load interconnection. Those are all available online. And there are folks standing by, a specific team for solar interconnection assistance, which is really great folks to have that resource. So wanted to make sure that was available to you. And if there are questions or specific experiences that we should chat about, I'm happy to do that as well.
Anyone have any questions related to interconnection or just any questions in general too?
Yeah, I think this is my last. I have like a thank you slide, but if there's any, we could open it up here to any other discussion as well.
Yeah, and please feel free just to come off mute and ask questions. No need to come on camera if you're shy or having your lunch or whatever, but if it's easier just to unmute and speak, please do so. Okay, I am not seeing any more questions. I can go ahead. I'll just share my last slide, and then I will go back and see if there's any new questions in the chat. Yeah. So before we close, I just want to make sure I share with you all just what we have for our upcoming workshops. And so I think folks who are getting our newsletter, communities know that we're doing regular office hours through March 26th. And that's on a normal day happening 1 to 2 p.m. on Tuesdays. They're all on Zoom, and the link is available through our newsletter, and I'll try to drop it in the chat too before we before we head out, but you should be receiving that link via email as well today. That will be scheduled from 2 to 3, and that's, stop in on Zoom if you have any questions, you want to work through some grant challenges, questions that you're hoping to have addressed, you want to do some project scoping, however we can assist you with your projects. And then just to follow up on the climate change and drinking water workshop that we had on the 18th, we're doing part 2 of that workshop with Casco Bay Coastal Academy. And that's Thursday, excuse me, February 22nd. And we'll put the registration link for that in the chat. Excuse me. Let's see. Are there any other questions before we close? Well, I'm not seeing any. So I want to thank you so much, Ethan. We really appreciate it. Like, lots of great information. I'm going to look forward to reviewing the slides again and listening again as well. I really thank you for your time and also for responding to the questions we shared with you and taking the time to pull this together for us and the communities in our region. So this is a great resource. It's, like I said, we're recording this. It'll be made available on our YouTube. And before the end of the week, we'll send out the newsletter, our next newsletter, which will contain the link to the recording, a resources sheet that we'll put together with all of the links that were shared during the presentation in Ethan's slides. We'll share the slide deck and also Ethan's contact information. So folks will have a comprehensive list of the resources that were shared today. So I think that's good. I'm seeing thank yous in the chat, and I think we can say goodbye. So thanks so much.
Thank you
Thanks,
all.
everyone.